Hi all, I have a rather fascinating game to show you. Leela, a version of Leela rather, was playing against Bluefish Dev. So let me introduce Bluefish Dev. This has been used throughout TSEC as the kind of point of reference for the games in progress. It's a kind of supercharged version of Stockfish. They say one account says roughly 3 times the nodes per second as ordinary Stockfish. So it wouldn't be allowed for the TSEC hardware regulations, basically. And also, not only that, the real Stockfish, this is a version, the real Bluefish rather, has a 7-man table base rather than a 6-man table base. If you know about table bases, they take a huge amount of data, and 1 extra man is a gigantic increase in the amount of storage needed. But so this version actually of Bluefish was 6-man table base. Now the version of Leela is by J. Horfoss, T40 T6 532, and on the information about it, it says whimsically it's from the parallel universe where Leela T40 mutated and evolved a win-draw loss head, and we halved the learning rate, LR I believe, and provided it a partial 7-man table base rescoring. Net equivalent is 42,128 by training steps, forked from 42,000, and still pure Leela and only trained using Leela self-play games. So yes, we have very interesting versions of these arch rivals in this game. Do they carry the same genetic strengths and weaknesses? Let's have a look. D4 from Leela. We have knight f6, c4, e6, g3, so Catalan territory. We have d5, bishop g2, bishop e7, knight f3, both sides castle, and now d takes c4, so this does seem a great Stockfish choice, which it has suffered a number of losses in a particular variation of the Catalan opening, where it does play a kind of what humans might regard as slightly double-edged move b5. It exposes that diagonal potentially. It does cling on to the pawn for a bit. It's kind of underminable with a4 at convenience. And let's see, so what happened? a4, it is actually undermined immediately. b4, so the point is to try and perhaps get some counterplay of white took immediately, maybe with bishop a6 at some point. But we have actually knight fd2. So it's interesting, it's like this version of Stockfish generally is expecting a kind of materialistic dialogue, a materialistic conversation, and instead Leela kind of does the opposite of materialism, just trying to celebrate the other aspects of the pain that black is causing itself in this position. So just hitting that rook and trying to really celebrate maybe the c4 square. And this pain could be the root of further issues which could be concrete later. So that's very interesting here, like the c4 square. If a bishop landed on c4 later, then that celebration of that pain that black is self-inflicting here by this variation, for example, could be undermining the pawn chain later with f4, f5, you can imagine. A nice bishop perched on c4 as an example. So the dialogue of both is very, very different. So this is kind of unexpected, perhaps, knight fd2, and very unexpected now after c6, blunting the bishop, stopping the bishop, taking the rook, is to just give up the d4 pawn. But this is a very, very interesting, subtle way, perhaps, of exploiting the pain the suffering that black is causing itself in this opening by taking this pawn, which Stockfish, the ordinary Stockfish, has lost in a number of games now, including against the Houdini chess engine, which it got knocked out in a key game in the Catalan in the last TSEC Cup. Houdini hasn't even been that much updated, and it managed to beat the ordinary Stockfish from this position. So does Bluefish Dev, which can calculate 3 times as more powerfully, 3 times as quick, have something up its sleeve here not known about? We have rook d1, the queen goes to c5. So this looks very familiar, with the queen bouncing via c5 to h5 to hit h2 to make knight g4 a concrete threat. It temporarily pins, of course, that knight. The bishop kicks the queen, goes to h5. And now we have knight bd2. So the ordinary Stockfish would have played knight g4 here. And the first surprise of the game, knight d5. So not knight g4. So we've seen games where Stockfish was interested in taking out the dark square bishop. Is that the case here? Knight b3. In fact, not very long to still do the same kind of thing. Knight takes e3 is played here. So why is this? Because it did seem to blunt the diagonal. It did seem kind of nicely perched on d5. Wasn't this going to be like the kind of refutation of White's play in a way, with the deeper version of Stockfish? If we look at knight d7, knight d4 may be a good try. For example, like this, bishop f3 kicking the queen, and knight f5, and that knight shows itself as a kind of tactical liability, an excuse to play moves like this, where d5 and a8 is loose. And for example, this position where White could get a significant advantage, structural damage concretely now for Black. White's doing very well there. So we have knight takes e3, knight takes, and now a6. You might wonder why this move a6. As an example, a disastrous example, which maybe I haven't shared with you about this position, why a move like a6 would be needed. If we look at rook d8, this is a funny one. White could take and then take here, and if knight takes, this is actually a double attack on a8 and e8, and the back row is actually weak. So for example, this is checkmate. So a move like a6, it does seem a bit weird that, despite all this calculation power, Black is reduced to this position with just the queen really out on h5, most of the pieces visually on the back row. So it's interesting, this dialogue on the chessboard with this calculating monster and Leela, a great version of Leela, still results in this position where, Leela is really after the longer term celebration of Black's materialism. The materialism has created some symptoms. I mean, in particular, White's pieces qualitatively are controlling nice key squares. C4 in particular really jumps out as a major square to use. As I mentioned before, for example, if the bishop was there later, that could be used for undermining the pawn chain. A lot of the pawns are on light squares here. But furthermore, the symptoms of Black don't end with the C4 square. By the pieces over here are kind of, there's a certain threshold of trappability, I would say, with these pieces, not just being hemmed in or contained, but trappability if Black's not careful, as some of the variations we'll see kind of witness. The other aspect is this d-file, the actual d-file locking down, containing Black's pieces by doubling on the d-file. The rooks qualitatively will often be better than the Black rooks. Now, this is not a 100% guaranteed win. There was a game at a faster time limit where Stockfish did actually draw with this position with Black, something like this recently, but it has lost a few as well. It's not a guaranteed win though. So let's see what happened. Knight c4. We have rook a7. So Black's trying to crawl out. Rook ac1, c5. So this does kind of self-contain the bishop on e7. Knight ba5, queen g5 was played. So very interesting move. Very, very interesting tactical move. It looks like it's been tactically generated anyway. If bishop d7, b3 is nice to play, just keeping up this grip on the light squares, saying to Black, what are you doing? And White could build up. This is an example. Say Black was desperate enough to play this, to challenge the bishop. So giving White the light square bishop, this would be a great way to make sure the knight's not going anywhere. And as an example, just build up like this is a good example of light square domination. Basically, I'd call light square domination with an infiltration point on d6 here if the bishop ever neglects d6. This kind of position is just going to be very nice for white. So, okay, queen g5, we have h4, queen f6, and now a really interesting move, queen e4. In some weird and wonderful variations, this queen e4 does actually support the move queen a8 when the rook's not protecting it, to sort of harass these pieces. This is the self-inflicted pain that black did in the opening because of the kind of materialistic agenda that seems to be in the long engineered code. One of the the fundamental assumptions about evaluating positions, materialism, but it can be a source of pain, and it's as if Leela is celebrating that pain and ready to celebrate it, the kind of trappability of these pieces. We look at rook c7, and already, even here, this is a legal move, queen a8. It doesn't actually do anything much here, but under certain circumstances, queen a8 could be painful for black. If king h8, just as an example, I wanted to ask the question, what would white do if black did nothing here? And so I'm just putting the king back and forwards. What would white do? White could do something like this, use that c4 square concretely as a pivot to attack the black queen. The black queen is prone to attack in this position. It's ahead of the pawns. It's not within the pawn structure. And you can see a big tempo gainer, rook f4 here, would have to be factored in. And so this is a kind of disaster scenario if black did nothing. That's a total disaster. Just for the record, what does black... How is black suffering concretely? If you wanted to ask that, you could ask it just by some king moves, token king moves. But anyway, rook c7, rook d3. So this is dual purpose, it seems, offering, it's the possibility of rook f3, which has to be factored in now at all times. But the middle point is doubling the rooks. So qualitatively, the rooks are really much stronger than the black rooks. We see g5 here. It's interesting here that this does neglect a8. Now this is just for amusement. Queen a8, just to prove it is a possible move. It could be played. For example, like this would end up with a small edge for white if black's not careful. Black can do better. This was just really for amusement to see if queen a8 was a playable move under certain circumstances. But black could equalize with this kind of thing, a bit more slight edge for white still, yeah. But anyway, rook d3. So the queen, does have that possibility of going to the outer reaches of the position here, touching these guys. As I say, they're kind of vulnerable. They're not just contained. It's interesting. Sometimes we don't really think about the trappability aspects of contained pieces. We just think they're contained, but they're also kind of tactically vulnerable in other respects as well. So we have g5, and this does seem a kind of prone to pawn structure fragmentation by moving pawns which can't go ever backwards. This is a very committal decision structurally. So in human chess, of course, we think very carefully about how we place our pawns. Karpov once said, the opening where your pawn structure is decided, you have to make your bed and sleep in it, and after you have to be very careful what you do with your pawns, and the openings often determine the pawn structures, hence Karpov's quotation. Here, if king h8, rook cd1, just an example again, what if black didn't do anything, then this kind of thing, and you can see c7 a big target, as well as b8, for example, like this, and then b8 dropping. Yeah, I mean, the b8 knight is, if you look at this position, is amusingly, it is a tactical vulnerability. It's not just that they're contained, they're under observation potentially, they're under scrutiny, their very existence is threatened in some variations. And here, if bishop b7, this is an interesting one where rook takes f7, it's possible unveiling the attack on b7, so getting a big advantage. And let's see, there was something else. Rook d7 here is an amusing example where actually the move queen a8, which queen e4 affords, again, is harassing these pieces. So these contained pieces that really do have other aspects of tactical liability to be kind of celebrated by white. So for example, like this, where queen b7, and there's a ridiculous idea from a clinical perspective here. White could just take on d7, but there's actually, just to emphasize this other aspect of liability, white could actually, as well as rook takes d7, play rook d6 rather amusingly, and kind of checkmate the knight on b8. And this would actually be the top most clinical way of exploiting white's position, that knight being checkmated here. So containment has led to trappability and actually winning material. Bang, the knight would go off the board, and white could actually come back to sort out any counterplay issues with a big advantage. So yeah, it shows that the materialism of black in the opening, some of these variations, is not just that the pieces are contained, they're actually tactically vulnerable in their own right. So anyway, g5, it's kind of an active looking move, and in fact, instead of hg, which one might expect to try and celebrate the h file, for example, but it would immediately hit the rook. There are immediate tactical issues on hg, but it was all rejected with h5 actually. So that's interesting. It's sort of okay, so h5, just have a quick look at hg. So queen takes hits the rook. Say the rook moves, it does control the d file. White would still be okay, but maybe this is black's way of trying to generate some counterplay. White still, technically, it seems, has a small edge here. So this is very interesting. It's more containment style, you could say, h5. And it's on light squares. It's probing light squares. And it's got the potential for the dreaded form pawn as well. h6. The dreaded form pawn seems to be a very recurrent theme, which has aspects of containment, of course, as well, the form pawn. And in fact, here, immediately, we see, in this position, h6. So if queen takes h6, there's actually queen e5 targeting the rook. And if bishop d8, then bang, rook takes d8, and queen takes, absolutely winning. All three of these guys are now forked with the queen. Just doing her own thing over here does not help. An amusing position indeed. So we have actually, if rook a7, then queen takes b8. Again, the poor knight can be victimized in some of the variations of this game, at least. So queen f6. But is this a tactical liability later, this h6 pawn? That's the thing. Is it a bit double-edged? b3 is played. Bishop d7. Here, if rook d7, then rook takes, knight c6. And look at black's position visually. It's really suffering. If king h8, knight takes, queen c6, and then knight d6. And it's the c8 bishop, which is now the victim of this. So as I say, yeah, it's maybe containment. We can think of it maybe about containment for its own sake, or containment with a view to sometimes winning the contained pieces at leisure, as this shows it as well. The knight winning the bishop here is quite nasty. So black has to be extremely careful in this position. So bishop d7. We have queen e3. g4 is played. On king h8, as an example, knight d6 is a very good point to use in this particular position. So dislocating that c5 pawn, it's no longer supported. And if c5 is won here, white's getting a big advantage with material back. So g4 is played. Now rook cd1 is the preferred move here. There's possibilities of queen g5 now from black by playing g4. That g4 square vacated, so maybe trying to win h6 after. So white plays this move to double the rooks. Okay, and we have bishop e8. On another example, king h8, what does white do? Knight e5, knight takes g4. That pawn is also a liability, so big advantage for white. So the point is, yeah, that here, Okay, after bishop e8. In fact, instead of knight e5 here, white played the move king h2. This does get really involved. I could only show you a glimpse of some of the variations and some of the maybe the philosophies behind that we can get from our own games, really. If instead of king h2, which looks a bit strange, I thought initially the idea was rook h1 and king g1. I thought maybe there's some issue with bishop e4. If we look at bishop e4 directly, maybe you might think king g2 and rook h1 is tempting, and then maybe something like rook h4 or 5. But here, queen g5, this position, f5 tempo gainer and supports g4. But even so, white would still end up with a small edge in this kind of scenario. Black's got that bishop pair, but white has a lot of control in this position. Okay, king h2, queen g5, offering the exchange of queens. If king h8 here, knight e5, and this scenario, knight takes g4 is possible, showing that c7 is a liability. That waiting move, king h8, is not so neutral because of the checking and taking here. If we try something else like knight d7, then knight c6, and then taking on e7, and then rook d6. Once white gets this a6 pawn, this is a strong outside pass pawn with its own perk of this Catalan bishop supporting that pawn. These scenarios are very favourable for white, generally speaking, in the Catalan. The outside past h pawn is especially underlined by the Catalan bishop. So big advantage for white there. So anyway, queen g5, queen f4, just offering exchange of queens. So queen takes f4 was played. If we look at an alternative to queen takes rook c8, yeah, because the rook was attacked. This one is still good, yeah. Torture on the queen side. And you can see actually that the b8 knight is again a kind of victim here, basically. Or here, rook takes that knight. If it ever moves, then bang, bishop takes. And there's a big punishment with knight takes f7 check here, tactically. So these variations show that the black pieces are being targeted behind the scenes a lot. Queen takes, g takes, knight d7, knight c6, bishop h4, king goes back. If f3, that interrupts the c6 knight, so that could be taken. So the king just goes back, knight f6. We have knight e5, knight h5, e3, g3, and now f3. It seems as though f takes is an alternative. For example, knight takes, knight d6, white has a small edge there as well. So f3, we have bishop e7, knight d7. Yes, and now actually black gives up the light square bishop. Rook takes, rook fc8, knight b6, so more simplification. But now with two pieces attacked here, so the rook's attacked, the bishop's attacked, the rook goes to protect. We have bishop f1 targeting the a6 pawn. Now, knight f6 hitting the rook, rook b7, and now to respond to the threat of bishop takes, a counter threat on e3 is played, knight d5. And in fact, instead of knight takes here, we have just the knight coming back. White, it seems, has, for the pawn at this point, succeeded in encouraging a weak pawn here, but this pawn's weak, especially to bishop f8. So once these two weaknesses are kind of the exchange of prisoners, as Nimzowitsch would say, when both sides exchange off weaknesses, what is the scenery here? What does it actually represent? Well, white has this rook on the 7th, which Nimzowitsch was also a great fan of, a potentially dangerous past a pawn. If the a6 pawn is ever taken, this is still a potentially dangerous passed pawn. More subtly, though, that c4 square especially in relation to the rook on the 7th, and this massive pawns here, can be used by the bishop to establish itself on c4 for f5 push, which is thematic against the French defense structures. And we're about to see that now. So first, the first episode from here is the exchange of prisoners episode. So bishop f8, king g2, bishop takes, king takes. So now, episode 2, the use of the c4 square as a basis for undermining the pawn chain here with f5, especially with the rook on the 7th rank. These two guys are the next targets. Bishop goes back, e4, kicking the knight back, knight e7. Shielding also the 7th rank. If knight c3, that doesn't shield the 7th rank. Knight e5 hits f7. And this scenario, if black defends f7, it's at a major cost. Big outside pass pawn here, white's got a big advantage. So shielding that 7th rank, knight d6, rook d7. This is pure torture now, this position. After rook d7, black is waiting basically for things like bishop c4 and f5. The knight's kind of virtually pinned to f7, but f7 is the one to dismantle black's pawn chain in the center and expose king safety issues. So, okay, we have a5. At least the bishop's not going to be winning the a pawn. Bishop c4, but what a beautiful place for the bishop. So one of the classic Fischer-Spassky matches had a bishop on c4. Really, really nice. But here you can see the power of f5. Incoming f5 is hugely powerful now in this position. Not only that, what has also happened is the king qualitatively is much stronger than the black king. It's much more out and about, this king on g3. So black's pieces are passive, although it's opposite colour bishops. This seems very bad for black. In fact, we have more simplification. Knight c8, the knights come off, and this gives up the a pawn potentially. So rook a7, bishop d6, and that pawn is taken. So an outside passed pawn now. Yeah, black's in big trouble, and there's still this idea of undermining the pawn chain once white is ready by unpinning the f5 pawn. F5 push is going to be extremely dangerous thematically for black, and we see that soon. e5, and now rook takes c5 actually. So black volunteered the c5 pawn here, didn't go to e7, because rook a7 and f5 is really stuff like that is really good. If it went to b8, rook a8 is a nasty pin, and this scenario, for example, that a pawn is winning here with this kind of scenario. It's going to be winning material. Yeah, it's just hopeless for black. So we have bishop c7, and now rook takes c5, king e7, a5, king d8, a6, bishop b6, rook b5, bishop a7, and now finally here we have the move f5. So yeah, black's earlier moves right in the opening, it seems that c4 square is actually useful for something in a strategic sense, in a long-term strategic sense. Perching a bishop on c4 is a great use of the c4 square sometimes as well. Just it's undermining this pawn chain now. And with the king on g3, this is only like a temporary pawn sack, and if white basically ends up getting two connected passed pawns, that's extremely dangerous. And in fact, here, rook b8 was played. If e takes, then the king walks in with king f4, taking here, two connected passed pawns. It's a massive position for white. So rook b8, pleading more exchanges. Rook a8 is played. Sorry, rook a5, e takes, bishop takes. Yeah, this f5 looks vulnerable now. bishop b6, rook a2, rook c8, king comes to f4, h5, and we've got now two connected pass pawns here as well as a pass pawn here. Is black overloaded despite the opposite coloured bishops? We see rook c7, and this pawn is just given up basically, yeah, with rook c7, that's taken. It does seem as though there's a lot of good options for white in this position. A lot. So yeah, this is rather desperate, rook c7. So that's taken. So there's two connected pass pawns now here and one there. So the opposite coloured bishops seem very unlikely to help. So a6 is exchanged for b4. Two connected pass pawns here as well as a third pawn over here. It's all over bar the shouting. The great Leela technique is about to be witnessed for this endgame phase. So what is the Leela technique here for this endgame? Well, pushing the pawns seems fair enough so far. Nothing too special there. And yep, the pawns are ready to roll. Okay, giving up b5. There's still two connected pass pawns. And now e7 is going to be the one supported to push these pawns through. This was desperate from black, rook c7. White's still in time now, like in a famous Carlsen-Karayakin game we once covered, where similar kind of scenario, opposite coloured bishops. Magnus Carlsen eventually crashed through despite the opposite coloured bishops. Just about. So king takes, queening. And the game... This is move 103. The game carried on to move 212. It is a particular version of Leela, maybe with greater Benny Hill aspects. So okay, high level shuffling, and it continued. Yes, under promoting a knight. Okay, so knight came over here, and curious. Yes, it was curious. This is just for the record. It's not the official version of Leela, honest. So Leela really having fun here in this winning position, a kind of celebration of mockery, having a winning position, giving up the knight. Eventually the queen and king kind of cooperate when they're bothered to checkmate the black king eventually. Okay, yeah, so it seems even if Stockfish is supercharged in a nutshell, this Catalan variation, we can say it seems to be a bit dodgy in a nutshell, this Catalan variation. We can also say that containment of pieces, also sometimes this has this aspect of winning those pieces that are contained, I believe, from the variations in the game. If you enjoyed this game video, please click on the top left box, which should appear shortly. Become a member at chessbowl.net, play against other YouTubers. You can also test yourself on the variations covered in this and other games. From the improved menu, there's a puzzle books option, which also has a link to the annotated game. Comments, questions, donations, see the description. Like, share, subscribe with the notification bell, really appreciated. Thanks so much.